This 1901 portrait of a traveling salesman seems innocent until you notice the woman in the mirror. At first glance, it looks like any commercial photograph from the turn of the century. A man in a pressed suit, hair pomaded, expression pleasant but unremarkable. He sits beside an open sample trunk, displaying the tools of his trade. The kind of image you might find in a local history museum, labeled something like Commerce in Early Cleveland, and then promptly forgotten. But someone did not forget. And once they saw what the photograph actually contained, they could not look away. Elena Marchetti had been cataloging the Horvath collection for nearly 4 months when she lifted the portrait from its acid-free sleeve. She was a photo archivist at the Western Reserve Historical Society, one of those sprawling institutions in Cleveland that held more material than any 10 curators could process in a lifetime. Her specialty was labor history, specifically the visual records of Ohio's industrial boom between 1880 and 1920. Factories, foundries, garment shops, the faces of workers who built fortunes they would never share. She had seen thousands of these images. She knew how they were staged, what they meant to obscure, and what they accidentally preserved. The Salesman photograph arrived as part of a larger estate donation. The Horvath family had deep roots in Cleveland's old Hungarian community, and when the last surviving heir died in 2019, the contents of the family home went to the Historical Society. Most of it was mundane: furniture catalogs, church bulletins, a few portraits that looked professionally taken but held no obvious historical significance. Elena almost filed this one without a second look. The salesman was handsome in a forgettable way. His sample case held brushes, shoe polish, and what appeared to be small tins of some kind of ointment or balm. A mirror stood behind him, angled to make the small room look larger. Standard studio trick. Nothing unusual. Then she adjusted her magnifying loupe and leaned closer. The mirror. Something was wrong with the mirror. At first she thought it was a flaw in the glass, a ripple or warp that distorted the reflection, but as she moved the image under her lamp, she realized the shape was too precise, too human. There was a figure in the mirror, a young woman, visible only from the shoulders up, wearing a dark uniform with a high collar and a small emblem on the chest. Her face was partially turned, as if she'd been caught mid-motion, stepping out of frame. Elena sat back. The woman was not in the main composition. She was not a wife or assistant or studio employee waiting her turn. She was hidden in the reflection, almost invisible unless you knew to look. And the emblem on her uniform, when Elena enhanced the scan and ran it through her reference files, matched a company that had been erased from most Cleveland histories. A garment manufacturer called Stannard-Vance, notorious among labor historians for one reason above all others. Their workers did not leave. Elena had spent 12 years in the archives. She had learned to recognize the quiet signs of something buried, the way a single image could hold a whole system if you knew how to read it. The woman in the mirror was not supposed to be there, and the salesman, with his pleasant expression and his trunk of wares, was not what he appeared to be. She set the photograph on her desk and did not file it. Instead, she opened a new folder on her laptop and typed a single question into the header. Who was he really selling to? Elena's first instinct was to identify the photographer. The portrait had a small embossed stamp in the lower right corner, nearly worn away but still legible under magnification. J. Pollock, Commercial Photography, Cleveland. She cross-referenced the name against city directories from 1898 to 1910 and found a listing on Superior Avenue, a busy stretch known for its mix of commercial studios and immigrant businesses. Julius Pollock had been a moderately successful portrait photographer who catered mostly to merchants and salesmen. His work showed up occasionally in trade publications, advertisements for wholesale goods, that kind of thing. Nothing remarkable. But one detail in the directory listings caught her attention. Pollock's studio shared a building with a boarding referral service operated by a man named Elias Renner. The service promised to connect newly arrived immigrants with reputable boarding houses and factory employment. According to a 1903 advertisement Elena found in a Hungarian-language newspaper archive, the service specialized in placing young women in safe, supervised positions with guaranteed wages. Elena had seen this language before. It was the vocabulary of exploitation dressed up as opportunity. She reached out to a colleague at Case Western Reserve University, a labor historian named Thomas Okonkwo, who had written extensively on Cleveland's garment industry. When she described the photograph in the Stannard-Vance uniform, he went quiet for a long moment. "That company," he said finally, "was one of the worst. Not the largest, but the worst. They operated a closed boarding system. Workers lived in company housing, bought from company stores, owed company debts. Most of them were Hungarian, Polish, Slovak. Women who came over alone or were sent ahead by families who thought they were going to good jobs." He explained that Stannard-Vance had been investigated twice by state labor inspectors, once in 1899 and again in 1905. Both investigations ended without charges. The company had connections to local politicians and to a network of what the newspapers politely called labor agents, men who traveled through immigrant communities promising work, collecting small fees, and delivering workers to factories that had no intention of ever letting them leave. Elena asked if there was any documentation of how these agents operated. Thomas told her to look for the Reinhardt Papers, a collection of legal documents from a Cleveland attorney who had tried to bring a civil suit against several garment manufacturers in 1907. The suit had been dismissed, but the attorney's files survived. They were held at a small archive attached to a Catholic diocese office, uncatalogued and mostly forgotten. 2 weeks later, Elena sat in a basement reading room on the east side of Cleveland, paging through folders that smelled of mildew and old ink. The Reinhardt Papers were a mess, hundreds of pages of depositions, contracts, and correspondence, all jumbled together without clear order. But buried in the middle of a folder labeled Misc Testimonies 1906-1908, she found what she was looking for: a sworn statement from a woman named Marta Farkas. Marta had arrived in Cleveland in 1901, recruited from a village in Hungary by a man she described as well-dressed with a case of goods. He had visited her village that spring, selling brushes and small household items door to door. But his real business, Marta testified, was something else. He carried a list. He asked questions. Which families had daughters of working age? Which girls spoke a little English? Which ones had no fathers or brothers who might ask too many questions? He promised Marta a position in a respectable boarding house, steady wages, and the chance to send money home. She paid him a small fee for placement services. He gave her a train ticket to Cleveland. When she arrived, she was taken directly to a company dormitory attached to the Stannard-Vance factory. Her papers were confiscated. She was told she owed the company for her travel, her bedding, her uniform. She would work until the debt was paid. The debt was never paid. It grew. Every meal, every candle, every visit from the company doctor added to what she owed. She worked 16-hour shifts. She slept in a room with 11 other women. The doors were locked at night. Marta escaped after 2 years, with the help of a priest who smuggled her out during a Sunday service that workers were required to attend. She gave her testimony to Reinhardt in 1907 as part of his failed lawsuit. Then she disappeared from the record. Elena searched census data, immigration files, church registers. Nothing. Marta Farkas had vanished like so many others whose names appeared once in a legal document and then never again. But her description of the recruiter, the well-dressed man with the case of goods, matched the photograph exactly. Elena returned to the image. She scanned it again at higher resolution, looking for anything she might have missed. On the back of the original print, faded almost to invisibility, she found a penciled notation, 2 words and a date. Renner Associate, June 1901. The connection was now undeniable. The salesman in the photograph was not an independent merchant. He was part of Elias Renner's recruitment network. And the woman in the mirror, the one wearing the Stannard-Vance uniform, was almost certainly one of his victims. She had been photographed, Elena realized, not as a subject, but as an accident. A reflection that was supposed to be cropped out or painted over. But for some reason, it had survived. A ghost in the glass. To understand what the photograph really documented, Elena needed to understand how the system worked. She spent the next month building a picture of Cleveland's labor recruitment networks at the turn of the century. The pattern was grimly consistent. Agents like the salesman in the photograph traveled through immigrant communities in the Midwest, often posing as peddlers or merchants. They identified vulnerable targets, usually young women without family connections in America. They made promises. They collected fees. They provided train tickets. At the destination, the workers were met not by the respectable boarding houses they had been promised, but by factory representatives who took their documents, assigned them debts, and put them to work immediately. The closed boarding system made escape nearly impossible. Workers could not leave the premises without permission. They could not receive mail that had not been read by supervisors. They could not accumulate savings because their wages were paid in company scrip, usable only at company stores that charged inflated prices. This was not slavery in the legal sense. The 13th Amendment had abolished that. But it was peonage, a system of debt bondage that accomplished many of the same ends, and it was widespread. Historians have documented similar practices in southern turpentine camps, western railroad construction, and northern garment factories. What made Cleveland's version distinctive was its scale and its organization. The recruitment networks operated like franchises, with local agents reporting to central coordinators like Renner, who in turn had relationships with factory owners and city officials. Elena consulted with 2 more experts to fill in the picture. A legal historian at Ohio State explained how peonage prosecutions worked, or rather, how they failed to work. The federal government had outlawed peonage in 1867, but enforcement was almost non-existent. Local prosecutors had no incentive to pursue cases that might embarrass powerful industries, and workers who escaped faced the threat of arrest for debt fraud if they tried to testify. A specialist in immigration history at Cleveland State added another layer. Many of the women recruited into factory boarding houses had entered the country under informal arrangements, their passage paid by agents who then claimed ownership of the debt. This meant they had no legal standing to complain. If they went to authorities, they risked deportation. If they stayed silent, they remained trapped. The woman in the mirror, whoever she was, had likely faced all of these pressures. She had probably been photographed in the Stannard-Vance uniform because she was already inside. The system, already past the point where escape seemed possible. The studio where the portrait was taken shared a building with Renner's referral service. It was possible, Elena realized, that the photograph itself was part of the recruitment process, a kind of catalog, a way for factory managers to see the merchandise before it arrived. She found partial support for this theory in a letter buried in the Reinhardt papers. A 1902 complaint from a Stannard-Vance foreman to Renner complaining that the last shipment included 3 who were unsuitable for fine work. The language was chilling in its casualness, shipment, unsuitable, as if the women were bolts of fabric or machine parts. Elena photographed the letter and added it to her growing file. The salesman's portrait was no longer just a curiosity. It was evidence of a system, a single frame that captured the intersection of recruitment, deception, and industrial coercion. And the woman in the mirror was not a mistake. She was the point. What was supposed to remain hidden had been preserved by accident, and now, more than a century later, someone was finally looking. Elena brought her findings to the curatorial team in early spring. She had prepared a detailed memo, complete with scanned documents, expert citations, and a proposed reinterpretation of the Horvath collection photograph. She expected interest. She did not expect resistance. The meeting took place in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the Historical Society's main building. Present were Elena, the director of collections, the head of public programs, and a representative from the development office. The photograph was projected on a screen at the front of the room. The director of collections spoke first. He acknowledged that Elena's research was thorough and that the connections she had drawn were plausible. But he raised concerns about how the photograph could be presented to the public. The Horvath family had been generous donors for decades. The estate gift was substantial. If the society released an interpretation that cast a family heirloom as evidence of labor trafficking, there could be consequences. Elena pointed out that the photograph was not a Horvath family portrait. It depicted an unnamed salesman, probably not even a relative. The connection to the family was incidental. The development officer was less reassured. She noted that several other prominent Cleveland families had ties to the garment industry during the same period. If the society started reinterpreting old photographs as evidence of exploitation, it might open questions that donors would find uncomfortable. "We're not accusing anyone of anything," Elena said. "We're providing historical context. The recruitment system existed. It's documented. This photograph happens to show part of how it worked." The head of public programs offered a compromise. What if the photograph were included in a broader exhibition on Cleveland's industrial history, with the Stannard-Vance connection mentioned but not emphasized? The woman in the mirror could be noted as an unidentified worker without speculating about her circumstances. Elena felt the resistance settling into place. It was not overt hostility. It was something softer, a kind of institutional inertia that preferred vagueness to specificity, that treated discomfort as a reason for caution rather than honesty. She asked a simple question: "If we don't tell this story, who will?" The room was quiet. The photograph remained on the screen, the salesman smiling, the woman in the mirror frozen mid-step. Finally, the director of collections spoke again. He said he would need to consult with the board. He asked Elena to prepare a revised proposal that included alternative framings for the photograph. He thanked her for her diligence. Elena returned to her office and sat for a long time looking at the image on her screen. She thought about Marta Farkas, who had risked everything to testify and then vanished. She thought about the other women in the boarding houses, the ones who never escaped, whose names appeared in no depositions, whose faces survived only as accidental reflections. She opened a new document and began drafting a different kind of proposal. If the institution would not tell the story fully, she would find someone who would. 3 months later, the photograph appeared in a feature article in a regional magazine dedicated to Ohio history. Elena had partnered with a journalist named David Cahill, who specialized in long-form investigations of forgotten labor abuses. The article, titled "The Mirror's Witness," laid out the full story of the recruitment networks, the closed boarding system, and the woman whose reflection had survived by accident. The response was immediate. Readers wrote in with questions, with family stories, with fragments of memory that had been passed down through generations. One letter came from a woman in Toledo whose grandmother had told her about the Brush Man, a salesman who visited their village in Hungary and convinced several young women to emigrate. 2 of them had never been heard from again. Another letter came from a descendant of the Stannard-Vance family. He was not defensive. He was curious. He had known vaguely that his ancestors had been in the garment business, but he had never understood what that business actually entailed. He asked if there were more documents, more photographs, more names. Elena sent him everything she had. The Historical Society's board eventually approved a revised exhibition, smaller than Elena had originally proposed, but more honest than the compromise version. The salesman's portrait was displayed alongside Marta Farkas's testimony, the Reinhardt papers, and a detailed explanation of how the recruitment system had operated. A label identified the woman in the mirror as likely a Stannard-Vance worker, possibly a victim of labor trafficking. The exhibition included a section on resistance. Elena had discovered, through church records and community newspapers, that Hungarian and Slovak immigrants in Cleveland had organized informal networks to warn new arrivals about fraudulent agents. They had posted notices in ethnic halls. They had circulated descriptions of known recruiters. They had hidden women who escaped from factory boarding houses, moving them through a kind of underground railroad that operated in plain sight among immigrant neighborhoods. One of these networks had been coordinated by a Catholic priest named Father Joseph Kowalski, the same priest who had helped Marta Farkas escape. His parish records, preserved in the diocesan archive, contained dozens of coded entries, women listed as visiting relatives or receiving spiritual instruction who were actually in hiding. He had maintained this work for nearly 15 years until his death in 1913. The exhibition included his photograph as well, a thin man with a serious expression standing in front of a small wooden church. He had never been recognized for what he did. Now, finally, his name was attached to the story. At the opening reception, Elena stood near the salesman's portrait and watched visitors move through the gallery. Some paused at the image, leaning close to find the woman in the mirror. Others read Marta's testimony and shook their heads. A few took photographs of the labels as if they wanted to remember the names. A woman approached Elena and introduced herself as the great-granddaughter of a Stannard-Vance worker. She did not know if her ancestor had been recruited by the same network, but she knew the woman had spent years in a factory boarding house, sending money home to families she would never see again. "She never talked about it," the woman said. "Not to my grandmother, not to anyone. We only found out from documents after she died." Elena nodded. She had heard this before. The silence of survivors, the weight of stories too heavy to tell. "Thank you for finding her," the woman said. She was looking at the mirror, at the reflection that had almost been erased. Elena did not know what to say. She had not found anyone, not really. She had found an accident, a flaw in a photograph, a ghost that had refused to disappear. The woman in the mirror remained nameless. Her fate remained unknown. But she was visible now, in a way she had not been for more than a century. That was something. It was not enough, but it was something. The salesman's portrait still hangs in the Western Reserve Historical Society, though now it carries a different label. Visitors who stop to look are told about the recruitment networks, the closed boarding houses, the debts that could never be repaid. They are told about Marta Farkas and Father Kowalski and the thousands of women who passed through Cleveland's garment factories during the years of industrial expansion. And they are told to look closely at the mirror, to notice the figure that was almost invisible, to understand that old photographs are not neutral objects. They were made by people with purposes, staged to show certain things and hide others. The camera recorded what its operators wanted recorded, but sometimes, by accident or oversight, it also recorded what they wanted to forget. The woman in the mirror was not supposed to be part of the composition. She was meant to be cropped out, painted over, erased. But she survived, a witness to her own exploitation, preserved in glass and silver. There are other photographs like this one. In archives and attics across the country, in the frames of portraits that seem ordinary at first glance, there are hidden figures, reflections, shadows, hands in strange positions, objects that should not be there. Each one is a potential doorway into a history that was never supposed to be told. The practice of looking, really looking at these images, is itself a form of resistance. It means refusing to accept the stories that were constructed for us. It means asking who was in the room when the photograph was taken. It means wondering whose labor made the wealth that the portrait was meant to celebrate. Elena still works at the Historical Society. She still catalogs photographs from Cleveland's industrial past. But now, every time she lifts a new image from its sleeve, she looks not just at the subject, but at the edges, at the backgrounds, at the mirrors and windows and reflective surfaces that might have captured something the photographer did not intend. Because the stories are there, waiting. And sometimes, all it takes is one person who refuses to look away.